So hello everyone, and welcome back to the second cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I am really happy and honored to have here as guest Professor Bob Condia from Kansas State University. Bob Condia, a fellow of the AIA, partner with Condia and Ornelas Architects, and a professor of architecture at Kansas State. He teaches design as art within the biology of perception and the sensible poetics of an architectural experience. A studio critic for 33 years, he was a 2017-20 Regnier Chair, a 2017 Design Intelligence Most Admired Educator, and won the Wayne McElvey Teaching Award also in 2017. Professor Condia's place in the neuroscience for architecture debate seeks the consequences of the applied science for architects. Thank you very much for being here, Bob, and I really look forward to your lecture.
Thank you. Nice to, oops, let's go back to the beginning. Uh-oh. I guess you get a preview. You know, you can see form in 1/10 of a second. There we go. So just a couple lessons today. I want to talk about aesthetic experience, and I want to talk about vision. And by aesthetic experience, I mean how we engage with space. So for an architect, we'll try to say, what is it that architecture does? So I've been wondering about this for quite some time. The neuroscience has really helped me understand better what it is that architecture does. And then how do we see architecture? We so often say that architecture is a visual art, and that's just not true. But I'm going to mess you up just a little bit. Can I say that? Is there a way to say that in German? I'm going to mess your brains up. So if you don't want to have your brains messed up, you should get off now, because we're going to make you think very strangely here very shortly. I like this image too, that recognize that there's no distinction between the brain and the body. It's the same thing. The heart has lots of nerves that are like a brain. Your stomach has lots of nerves that are like a brain. There is no difference between the body and the brain. So when we say the brain, we really mean the whole body. This isn't going to play, but I'm going to play it because I can't never figure out how to make the music go. So in this scene, which I like to start with, Beethoven comes in and he's deaf now and he can't hear what's being done. But this guy, Frederick, is going to become his secretary. He says, what is music? And the guy says, well, it exalts the soul. And Beethoven says, utter nonsense. If you hear a marching band, is your soul exalted? No, you march. If you hear a waltz, you dance. If you hear mass, you take communion. He says the power of music to carry one directly into the mental state of the composer. The listener has choice. It's like hypnotism. So that was in my mind. So this is the same thing I would argue about atmosphere and architecture. The observer has no choice. The first time I came across an idea that there was involuntary response in aesthetic experience was a book by Arthur Koestler called The Act of Creation. Apparently it's a cult book, meaning only a few people understand it, but if you understand this book, it will change your life. He says that creativity has 3 characters: a jester, a sage, and an artist. The jester will make you laugh, the sage will make you revel, and the artist will give you drama, will make you weep. He says these are involuntary responses, and this is where aesthetics begins, in an involuntary response. See if I can demonstrate. I'll watch your face, see if this works. In school, they told me practice makes perfect. Then they told me nobody is perfect. So then I stopped practicing. Right, no one laughed. All right, so.
No, we did, we just have the mics off.
So the humor is the easiest one to speak about in terms of the involuntary response, because laughter you understand. But let me dissect just a little bit about what we can think about in terms of the lesson from this. One is aesthetic means a recreative act, that you've participated in it. And so for the architect, this implies a couple things. One thing is that you have to get people on board with you, right? You have to have people participating. They told me practice makes perfect. And then they told me nobody's perfect. So you're participating now, you're coming along for the ride. And then in humor, we snap that emotional inertia, and emotions have inertia. If you have any doubt about emotions having inertia, get in a fight with your significant other. And it was just a case of misidentity. And now you're laughing about it, but you're still crying. The emotions have to wring themselves out. Emotions have inertia. The mind is very quick. And so practice makes perfect. Then they told me nobody's perfect, so I quit practicing. So there's this quickness in the brain, that snap then is what gives us humor. Recreative act is the biggest lesson that comes out of the act of creation. That and the recognition that aesthetic experience is involuntary. The other thing we'll look at about aesthetic experience is always a combination of thinking and feeling. Thinking and feeling. Thinking moves feeling into higher planes. And again, we could think about it in simple relationships. If I send a letter saying, sorry, honey, it's all over, and we've invested 5 years in the relationship, these are not meaningless terms on a piece of paper. These are powerful. So how does architecture recreate in the architects and we mean projected image? Well, Eventual, where I first ran into this term was in Arthur Kosa's book. And this guy, Robert Vischer's dissertation, phenomenal piece of writing. He says, on the optical sense of form, empathy is the source of our understanding of how others think and feel, right? The German word is pretty good, right? Eventual, pretty good. Feeling into, and in English we say empathy, it doesn't quite cover it. So feeling into something. And he asks, how can it be that we feel into architectural forms? This is really strange. How is it that inanimate objects also carry this? Well, the second time I met this idea was with Harry Mulgrave in these two books. And Harry was something of an expert on empathy in Eventual because he's working on Gottfried Semper. And at the time, I was thinking about aesthetic experience. I was thinking about it being involuntary. And if we add the neuroscience, then I argue it's now biological, right? So architects have always thought that empathy, our shared experience with spaces, is fundamental to our work. But when Harry says it's biological, this gives, I think, new levels of interest and new levels of power in terms of how we think about design. So in simplest terms, empathy, or Eventual for you, is an interpersonal, intersubjective, non-verbal communication and the presence of art. Let's face it, architecture is fundamentally a non-verbal communication through atmosphere, which influences behaviors. Depending on how you gauge the art impulse, it goes back at least 70 to 100,000 years, well before vocal cords were actually developed. Maybe Maria is even better at this, right? So the idea that the body and movement is in fact the communication of empathy well before we begin to speak about it. We just simply didn't need it. So depending on how you want, which archaeological notion that you want to discuss, I mean, the depth of art goes back to the mother-baby relationship, at least into the prehistory. All right, so what is it that makes, what is the biology of this empathy or Eventual? And that is called mirror neurons or mirror mechanisms. Have you guys, has this crossed your paths before, this idea of the mirror mechanisms?
It's the first time we talk about it now, yes.
All right, so I think you're going to hear a lot about this in our next series of discussions. But what was fascinating about this was in Parma, there was a experiment where they had a monkey wired to have his brain click in recognition when he was eating a peanut. So they found the part of the brain that eats peanuts. And as the story goes, one of the technicians came in and picked up a peanut, and they hadn't turned off the electricity. And so the monkey's brain is still working, and his brain lights up, but he doesn't have the peanut. And they'd been suspicious about this, according to the scientists, that maybe something was going on. But what they've later discovered and brought into the fore is that about 20% of the motor control neurons in the front of your brain are what are called mirror neurons. And their purpose is not to drive the body, but to recognize when someone else's body is doing something. And that is quite similar to your body doing those things, but trying to think of how to keep this short. We're talking now about what we'll call embodied stimulation. So the large version of this, the recognition of mirror neurons in the brain, is to tell you that how the brain works is through action, and those actions are controlled and understood outside of the body. And what your brain says is, if I was doing that, this is what I would be doing. This comes back to us in aesthetics, because if we think about aesthetics, and I've been recently looking into a guy named Alvin Noe, and he says, look, you've gone to the gallery opening with your friends, and you're looking at their work and it's opaque. It stays on the wall, so you find no attachment to it. And then your friend comes by and says, oh, by the way, did you think about this? And now the works come off the wall. They become alive. And what has changed but a recognition of an idea? And so quite similarly, this idea of embodied stimulation can be informed by the equation I said earlier, which is thinking and feeling. So we're connected to other people through empathy. And as it turns out, we're also connected to things through empathy. The embodied, and again, this is a theory about how we're in the world. Everything we do is through action. Everything is through embodiment. But it's really prefaced again by a philosopher of science, Merleau-Ponty, from the 1950s. And he says, no one can imagine a painter going to paint without their body. You got to take the body with you, don't you? And yet we would somehow think about anchoring the experience well within a brain. Well, Vittorio Glese, for me, has the most to say. He was present when they discovered the mirror neurons in Parma. And he got together with an art historian, David Friedberg, from Columbia. And this is quite a famous bit of literature in our unfolding discussion about neuroscience and architecture. It's kind of like the Villa Savoy of science bits, if I can use a building. Motion, emotion, and empathy and aesthetic experience. They put people in machinery that can look into the brain, and they recognize that people responded to both the shape and action of the cut strokes in Luca Fontana's painting, or in the action of the image of Doubting Thomas sticking his finger in Jesus' wound. And in both of these cases, people are involved in that in a way which doesn't fit the contemporary thesis of art history, which is to say, it's all cognitive, and in particular, culturally cognitive. And they said, nope, these are visceral responses. The body viscerally responds to this. The body recognizes this. So give art history its due, but frankly, there's also the body that's in play. And so the body participates in this simulation, not only in response to figurative things, but also in response to architectural forms. The twisting legs of our nymph on the right, the flying form of the angel above the arch. I mean, we're brought into these forms much the way we'd be brought into a painting. So the mirror mechanisms might allow us to know the hammer from only seeing its image or from hearing the sound of it striking. I assert we thereby recreate the experience of the hammer striking in our mind and body. This is pretty good. There's a lot of information about this. You can chase this down, or there might be a number of other kind of discussions with this team. But isn't it strange that just hearing the sound of the hammer in the other room, you would know exactly what was going on? It's pretty good. So we seem to be out of our bodies, and we seem to be doing it as a shared experience. Another rather famous piece of science, and you could see these images at the top. So there's a hand touching a chair, a leaf touching an arm, a hand touching an arm, or a leaf touching the chair. Now, in terms of bodily response in the fMRI, which is the magnetism of the brain, right? We could see where blood flows, and we say a correlation between how much blood is flowing to the brain is how active that part of the brain is. The same responses of the hand touching the arm are present, although not to the degree, when the palm leaf touches the chair. And as Harry Mulgrew likes to say, is architecture anything but materials not touching other materials? So an aesthetic experience is one that allows the beholder to perceive, feel, sense in artwork. And this comes from Vittorio Galese. And so I think he's pretty close to my definition. And this is coming from a review of neuroaesthetics, which in turn implies the activation of sensorimotor, emotional and cognitive mechanisms. We're tied into it. So aesthetic experience, people like to say, it's subjective. It's aesthetic experience. Well, the neuroscience teaches us this is a physical response. Or as I mentioned earlier, a letter coming from your loved one saying it's all over. This is a visceral response. It's not lightweight. And so we're participating through neuroscience in aesthetic experience, because I think it's the best one to speak about, the best way to define the architect's engagement, both as a designer and as a beholder. My point then is that neuroscience, by way of mirror mechanism, gives us embodied simulation, right? The theory of embodied simulation about how we are in space, how the brain works in that space, which are the mechanisms for making the recreative act. My assertion, right, that we are recreating, right? There's no creativity unless there's recreation. It has to be, and that this is bodily. And since it's bodily, it's biological. So I've often argued recently that as architects retreat through their digital work away from engineering, I think we're losing a lot of our prestige as experts. But it seems to me that if we went back to a Vitruvian notion of expertise, we again think about the medical aspects of our work, our biological aspects, and bring this into the play. Have architects not always thought about embodied simulation? I know what you guys are thinking. You're thinking, how'd they get that big stone up there? This is from the dolmen, or dolmens from the County Clare in Ireland. It's about 5,000 years old. So it must have been quite something for some people who are walking along the trail and see this big stone sitting up there and realize that that group of people that are around here have a level of cooperation, a technical prowess that they could put a stone on top of those stones like that. That's really quite something. Kahn begins design at the Kimball Art Museum by saying a silver light from above is the way in which art should be seen in Fort Worth, Texas. How do we get there? Ultimately, we get there through these Roman vaults with the center of the vault removed and the world's first lighting or natural lighting fixture to spread the light across the surface. Pretty good silver light. What is recreated, this is one of the best moods to see art that I know of. And this is really kind of the conclusion when you think about this, right? So what does architecture do? What does architecture do? Architecture creates mood. And when I first learned that from my work with Koso's book, I thought, oh, that seems pretty lightweight. We get mood. But mood is a psychological effect. And through neuroscience, we learn it is not lightweight. This is a serious thing that we make when we make mood. So the architect's empathy with the aesthetic experience of real architecture is corporal as mood. We'll talk about vision in a second. Understand that your recognition of a space can happen in 1/10 of a second or 1/4 of a second, not unlike thinking about what we call the first impression. That guy in the bar, that woman in the bar, rather quickly we know, is that a good one or not? Architecture is just as fast, based on as deeply experiential things as that. Mood takes somewhere around 7 to 10 minutes. We think it's around 9 actually, for a mood to change. We've done some experiments where we look at that. So these are the two frames that architects, I think, have when they're working particularly with atmospheres. How does an atmosphere adjust something? So mood then, what do architects do? Architects make mood. It's when we talk about a artistic endeavor, understand that all art is a mastery of a medium of expression. So the question architects have to ask is, what is the medium of our expression? And much of the science about creativity, it drives me crazy. The engineers say things like, well, we gave people a 3-minute introduction on how to be creative on this software, and then we told them to go be creative. Oh, by the way, here's a saxophone, go play jazz. It's ridiculous. So if mood is the medium of exchange between the architects and their beholders, how do we master mood? How do we master mood? And we need to know that it's a multi-sensorial experience. All of our senses are at play. I think Johanni Plasma's 7 senses is one of the best ways to take a look at that. Right? Our 5 senses, taste, sight, vision, hearing, touch, and then he adds gravity and haptics that come through vision. And we already point out that the neuroscience certainly supports his hapticity, meaning what we look at, we have a sense of whether it's soft, hard, right? We actually visually attend to it. All right, let's talk about vision for a second. Okay, so if you don't want to get messed up, you have to go now. You have to leave. In just a minute, it's going to change.
Well,
how do we see?
They have to get used to being messed up, because that's what their exercise this semester is all about.
Excellent. Good luck. All right, so I just point out that the human perception is by the whole body through embodied stimulation theory. Somehow that we privilege, probably because of embodied stimulation theory, sight over all other senses in architecture, right? That we can see surfaces, see aspects of textures and other engagements. We privilege sight over all others. Well, let's talk a little bit about sight. First of all, there's a difference between central vision and peripheral vision. I don't know, can we do this? Let's try. Can you put your fist out in front of you like that? There you go. This is central vision, a cone of about 5 degrees, right? And this is all there is. Everything else is peripheral vision, and I'll explain that. So we have across the campus here, one of the experts in central and peripheral vision in the world. And I went to his lab, and he has a thing for eye tracking, right? So wherever you look, you have a cone of 5 degrees. So a screen comes up. Wait a minute. Hang on. Screen comes up. Hit my keyboard. Screen comes up. And there's a spot over the text, which is clear, but it's only a 5-degree cone. And so wherever your eye looks, you can see with clarity in that 5-degree cone, and you can read the page. If we switch that, we put a black dot, so all of the page is completely clear for you, but there's a 5-degree cone, which is a black spot wherever you look, you cannot read. No one can. You would think you can. Look at all that text. Nope, can't read. Now you would like some peripheral vision because you want to like to be able to get ahead in the text. If we switch this, if we have a 5-degree encoded vision and we take a look at something like this, you have no idea what you're looking at. No idea, because you don't know where you're at. If we switch it and we block out a 5-degree encoded vision, you know exactly where you are. So this is the lesson, right? If we, I think Colin Illard put this together for us, and you can see how we have density in the center of the view, right? So this is what's hitting the retina in the back of your eye. We got density, we got texture, a lot of information coming in the center. And as we go out, we lose color and we lose distinction. And this is how the eye works. So what you should learn from this is that what you think of as vision is not optics and it's not a camera. It's a lot of imagination going on. You can see the black spot in there. That's the optic nerve. Nothing is read there. So the brain just fills this in. So we live in a matrix, if you will, of our own imagination. This is by my doctoral student, Kevin Rooney, and Kevin's dissertation was in the aesthetics of peripheral vision, right? So if central vision only gives us what we see, and we're making some fine generalizations here, right? There's what's called the ventral stream, and it goes down into the brain, and it says what we're looking at. It's the recognition of things. It's what we're looking at. It's slow processing. It gets good color. And it's what Kevin calls projected embodiment, what something is. The brain splits this, and again, there's a lot of cooperation going on, but in general, the brain splits this and pushes the where stream, the peripheral stream, up into the brain. And the where stream is very good about helping us with our balance, our context. It's very fast because it doesn't have much detail in it. And one of the other things you need to know is that you can have central vision and you can have peripheral vision, but you cannot have both at the same time. It's called attention. There's no such thing as a way of being in both central and peripheral. It's very fast, and this is why you can't text and drive, because you can't attend to both at the same time. This is how magicians work. You can distract your attention to something, and you simply cannot see what's going on. Your brain does not process what's going on when the magician's doing something, because he's got your attention someplace else. In architecture, it might be the front of a building, which is, or a sculpture, which is causing our attention to be focused in the magic that architecture can have. But again, follow this. Central vision, very narrow, tells us what something is. We read and write. Peripheral vision is everything else. And we're losing detail and focus all the way out to the edge. Now, can we learn about this? Well, here's the question is I've blocked out central vision. What are you drinking? Can you tell? I've only blocked out 5-degree cone. Well, you're drinking a cup of coffee. Where are you drinking it? All right. So this is the distinction. Colin Eller and I put an experiment together to try to think about this. as far as we know, no one's looked into this idea about how we are in space in terms of giving peripheral vision its due, because all people think vision is central vision. This might also be one of the distinctions that why architects and the rest of the world can't speak very well with one another, because we sense this peripheral experience as we're talking about our space. In fact, as I was reminded that we have a pretty good dance group across campus. And one of the dance teachers was over, we were talking with the students, and he got so excited because he says, architects can sense space behind them like a dancer. He was pretty excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
Our job as architects was to create, and I'd really like to spend some time explaining how genius this page is, but I'm not. Our job is to make 2 squares, and we figured there's about 3 minutes of virtual reality we could be in. So how long would it take to walk through these 2 perfect squares? We steal perfect from Vitruvius. 1 square is classical, we know, because we stole the facades from Michelangelo, the other from Rome, and the other space is modern, simply exactly the same proportions and proportional references, but now done in glass. Couldn't have a square without a focus, so we put a nice bright shiny egg in it. And what people would do is they would come into this and they would move from 1 square to the other in a kind of a movie setting in virtual reality. And then between the 2, we would ask them questions in kind of a gaming format. So here again is the classical and the modern and the plan. We tested people with galvanic skin response. And the reason we did this is because you need to know that there's a difference between emotions and feelings. There's a difference between emotions and feelings. Architecture responds in an emotive way, and emotions come before feelings. And if there's any doubt, next time you step off the curb in front of a speeding bicycle, stand there and kind of study your feelings for a second. And then the bike, of course, runs you over. You've already gotten out of the way, right? Emotion means motion. You're already moving. It's involuntary. And this is where architecture also lies. And so for our point of view, the only way we can look into this is to use devices which can see emotions in front of feelings. You can ask people about how they feel. Galvanic skin is like lie detector. It relates to your micro sweat on your fingers, and it tells us if you are stressed. It doesn't say if you're happy or sad, it just says you are stressed, and it's immediate and it's fast. This is an experiment that Colin did where they were walking around the Frank Lloyd Wright house, and you can see as it becomes more open, people become more aroused. Again, we don't know if they're happy or not. Here was the 3 situations. We ran several hundred college students in Waterloo through this experiment. There was the control, no difference in terms of how you would move through the space. Then we gave them the 5-degree cone of vision, the mask, and then we just blocked out the central vision. See if this works. So here's the experiment. We flashed this in VR because we didn't want people to have their eyes wandering. We asked them to stay on the fixation. You get the idea. That would be fun, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Not to, yeah, I'll run through the, Colin's much better at telling the data. Here it just shows that people didn't like and didn't respond well to only central vision, either model, the classical or the modern. And that when we asked them how they responded and how aroused they were, whether it was positive or negative, the central vision was least in terms of how they felt about it. And then in terms of legibility, you can see people really couldn't find their way, really had no idea. And yet central vision and peripheral vision was about the same. Very little difference. So the experiment then, from our point of view, pointed out a couple things. First, that the periphery has a lot of information about architectural experience, at least if you're walking through some urban squares. A lot of information. central vision plays a very little role in understanding where we are at and how we're moving through those spaces. This is especially true because, again, most people think vision is simply central vision. What something is the only thing they talk about. And again, I think this is one of those points that architects and our beholders and our clients, this is a miss, because we're talking about vision in totality, because this is our professional intuition, our understanding of space. Understand, they do not get it. They don't understand that way. They only think of vision as central. And that the ability to appraise a scene is much better, again, in peripheral vision. So that if architects are thinking about vision, then it's really the peripheral experience. And one other thing we might think about is that this, we think, can be trained, and actually is trained in architectural schools. All right, just to summarize. So one's immediate engagement with space is seen as pre-reflective and meaningful by what it offers in the choreography of the human dance. I steal this from Alberto Perez Gomez. He says that what we're doing when we're together as humans is a human dance. We know our part in it, and we play our part. It's pretty good. So I steal that from him. You can ask him about it in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Our experience of architecture is corporeal and emotive, perceived through enactments or embodied simulations through our own body. Why do we need to be able to imitate others? Well, if we had to try everything by putting it in our mouths, we would probably be dead pretty fast. So being able to rehearse and being able to learn through imitation is a profoundly articulated, evolved skill, particularly for architects, right? So how do we enact? How do we test designs through our bodies? My scientific colleagues still won't believe that when I tell them that I can play a floor plan as a musician plays musical notes on a page. They don't believe me. Maybe you don't believe me. I think it's absolute fact. I can walk through a building by looking at the plans. The plans are well prepared and to scale. I have no trouble knowing how it's going to respond in my body. The philosophical implications of mirror mechanisms cannot be understated. This giving a biological basis to how architects' intuitions and how we think about architectural space. This is big time. And then the biology of the eye teaches us we should really apply this duality of vision to the practice of architecture. I think after today, if you can speak about this with your clients and colleagues, that what you think of as vision is not what's happening. It's something else. And you need to be able to work in the peripheral vision. And again, one of the reasons people get sick in virtual reality is because it messes with your balance. So if you have any doubt that where the peripheral vision is part of your balance system, there, I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob.
And you can get these books if you want. They're free. They're online.
We already have one of them in the reading list, but I will add the one about affordances. I will definitely add it. Thank you.
I get to see where they go, and it's quite interesting because wherever Colin Ellard's been, there always seems to be a big flood of people. Did you unshare me? Excellent. Or I can unshare me.
I did so just so that we keep track a little bit of the time, so that we can really as much as possible make this conversation go. So thank you so much, Bob. There were so many really important topics and threads from the whole discussion about neuroscience for architecture. So this was really the best possible way to start with this cycle, and also to start with the course, because this is the first conversation we have, and it's the first time that our students are learning about these topics. So there were many new concepts, and in particular, for the exercise that our students are going to do. They are exactly going to collect during all these weeks of the semester. They are going to collect the movements that they find were most meaningful now to keep them going during the pandemic, the habits, and also to really pay attention to which objects, spaces, pieces of furniture, places in the city they connected the most. And we will work with this topic exactly to create these enactments and also addressing these topics of embodied simulation, of course, how these habits take shape in the buildings and in the objects that we design. So this was a wonderful overview. And I think our students are probably very stimulated at the moment. I also had to think when you were presenting your research about the importance of peripheral vision, I was thinking about architecture, and I had to think also about cubism, because actually what cubism did was try to present in a 2D space of representation what the observer would experience from reality as moving around, as if moving around. And what's so interesting, for example, about cubist paintings is that they have this really strong haptic quality and also sense of movement. And I wanted to ask you if by any chance did you think about this also? When did your interest in peripheral vision start?
Cubism is quite interesting. So it's kind of a bad joke when people would be in a museum and they would look at a Picasso and they go, well, that's not painting. Well, of course, that was the point, right? So the point is, how do you destroy classical painting? Because he was good at it. By the time he was 18 years old, he was one of the best painters in the world. How do you destroy that, which is the avant-garde, which is I think the avant-garde is dead except for certain parts of Kansas. The idea of destroying a painting is, as you suggest, to remove a single point of view, which also actually was going on in Impressionist paintings too. But here it's really quite deliberate to destroy that. But I often taught classes actually from Cubist painting as a source, as a way of building models and things in the early 90s. We called it deconstruction, but I didn't know that was the term until later. But there's no space without movement. No less than my friend Michael Arbit has pointed this out. There's no space without movement. So either the eyes are moving, and they twitch at least 3 times a second if they don't have a goal, or your body's moving. So Cubist paintings are much more spatial from that point of view. So yeah, I'm a big fan of kind of Cubism.
Yes, I really had to think about it, because from the way that you were describing, also it was very interesting when you showed this picture, which is almost like a still life with the coffee in the coffee shop, and then at some point we see just the coffee cup, and other times just the coffee shop, and it has exactly this kind of tactility and scent and atmospheric quality. So I really had to bring this up. And also something else that I had to make in connection was when you were mentioning with these really specific examples of the importance of peripheral vision, also how it's so important for us to communicate with other humans, and also to pay attention to what's changing in our surroundings. That is really, we might understand that there's something happening close to us before we realize that we're seeing it. And this, of course, also has to do with peripheral vision. And I also had this vision in my mind of this headpiece from the series of The Handmaid's Tale, that the women are forced in this dystopian universe, the women are forced to wear this cap that completely seals their peripheral vision. And I think it's also a fantastic way to show that a dystopian universe would not have access to peripheral vision as a way of communicating and being open to the information, and also to have empathy and to communicate with others.
Well, another thing, when I was back in my athletic days, when I was playing basketball, one of the really fun things to do is to learn that when your teammate is heading to the basket and you just see him in peripheral vision, then I can put the entire play together. And all I have to do, I'm going to hold the guy defending me by looking at him, and I'm going to put the ball right in front of my friend. And I think architecture is much like this, or architects. I mean, the ability to understand the broad space and how you feel the space. And again, I think this notion of the dancer is pretty good. So how do you know where the stage is? How do you know the edge of the stage is? And you just learn that, and it's part of your consciousness. And seeing is even in peripheral vision, seeing is even more than the optics. I mean, we seem to have an idea of the presence of the walls and things around us. There's some other thesis that's quite interesting. It's called event segmentation. And in this, the thesis is that when you come inside a room, your mind puts into short-term memory the space that you're in. And one of the bits about this study that they've done is that if you move from one space to the other, you carry something like a ball or a cube, and you put it down, you pick something else up. And if we asked you what you put down or picked up, you know exactly. Right? Oh, I put down a cube and picked up a ball. Great. If I ask you 3 rooms later, you have no idea, because your short-term memory has been overwritten so many times that it's very difficult to kind of pay attention to this. And this is really quite an interesting thing for architects. I mean, the idea that we operate through a sequence of rooms, one building on the next. We have a context from one space, a nice formal garden, entering into the building, into a lobby space that has statuary and other things, to go up a big stair, to then look back into the lobby space, and then so this kind of sequence of spaces are building up our sense of context. But we become immediate through short-term memory, right, into just one room or the other.
Yes, and this also brings me now to another thought, also a little bit influenced by what we were talking before, this question of the mood, of how important it is when we think, when we're designing, that to think that architects are creating a mood with spaces we design. And very often we might be distracted and feel that maybe we are a little bit more stressed or even in a bad mood, one would say, and we might not stop to think that it might have something to do with the places where we were during the day, or the places that we frequently visit because we have to work there, or we have to do a commute and we cross a number of ugly tunnels for a certain amount of time. So there's all these things that really can shape how our day goes. Of course, there's always the inner landscape. So what's going on with our own lives and what we're thinking. But it's really important to understand our bodies as this more porous agent, and this exchange, which is always happening from the out in and the inside out. But you also mentioned before in your presentation, I think you used somehow a term like that we are in some ways always surrendering to what the space delivers to us. That the space somehow determines how we are feeling. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
The longer version, I think some others will talk about the idea of affordances. What does a space afford us? And that affordance, what we can do there is framed by our context within which we bring to that, right? A bit like the coffee cup, right? What are we bringing to the coffee cup? And behavior is coded in the atmosphere in terms of how do we respond this way or that way. We come in front door to a bar and everyone's loud and the music's loud and everybody's drinking. It's a different atmosphere than walking into a library, which is calm and quiet and there's books on the shelves, so we have a sense of how to behave based on this kind of coded information, which comes as a context, so to speak. But the other thing about atmosphere that's interesting is that we share with it, right? By entering into the room. If we're the first one in the bar and no one else is there, that's a different feeling. Why am I the only one here? Versus when the room is crowded with people, or a room is crowded with your friends, or a room is crowded with people that aren't your friends. I mean, all of these affect us. So the mood we've come with is adjusted to the environment in which we find ourselves. And there's a language that's present for us. I mean, we understand this language about how the game is being played within these spaces. The reverse of this would be, we're talking about this in studio now, and my friend, Dr. Kanipa, that somehow musicians know exactly what notes to push to get an effect, to get an emotive quality. And I'm not so sure architects are even close to being aware of what they're doing, as you're suggesting. I mean, we make pretty ugly spaces. Well, they're cost effective. You know, why wouldn't you treat someone that badly if it's cost effective? So if atmosphere can be like music, and actually, when we talk about dance and we talk about plays, right, you see how much the music affects the atmosphere, which is anticipates how should I feel in this next scene. Well, the music has already told us that. How should I feel in this next room from the lobby into the library space? Well, the lobby has told us how we should feel in that next space, or maybe not. Maybe it was too banal. We did a study a few years ago where one of my best students was making a really beautiful design for a nature interpretive center, and it had this beautiful landscape, very modern landscape. And then for a drill, we put an Italian Renaissance garden right in front of it. And just looking at those two drawings, you could see there's an immediate response to an architect. And you say, well, okay, that's walking the front door is a different feeling. If I went through that garden, I just left the Renaissance, and now I'm in the nature center, a very different feeling than the other way around. That's a good question. Yeah. We like talking about atmosphere.
Bob?
I just noticed that Fred Marks is with us. Hello, Fred.
Yes.
Thank you for joining.
Well, I wouldn't want to miss Bob Condia's lectures.
Great. Fred, may you just introduce yourself before to our students?
Sure. A short introduction is that I am a visiting scholar at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California, and an immediate past president of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. So a couple of things for Bob. Number one, when you mentioned basketball, it reminded me of a famous experiment where the camera is located where the basket would be, and it's looking at people who are working their way towards shooting that ball. And as it applies to central and peripheral vision, they ask the people in the study first to look at a series of videos where you just see people playing basketball. The second scene is where there is a person dressed up as a gorilla passing them in the background. And they ask whether there was any difference between the first piece of film and the second piece of film, and no one noticed the gorilla. So it confirms your point of view as far as the limitations that we have.
Have you seen that, Maria?
Yes,
no,
I've heard about it, yes.
Yeah, no, you should send that, Fred. That's because that's exactly the thing. And the gorilla knows where to dance outside of peripheral vision as the women pass the ball between each other.
Right.
Yeah.
So the second thing I thought about is that where the optic nerve passes through the retina, there literally is a hole within our vision system. So I wasn't quite sure whether you were speaking of that when you showed us a still of an actual dot, or you were trying to explain a different part of this theory.
This is just taken from the eye tracking experiments of Leszczewski, where we block out central vision. So wherever the eye is tracking, we just block that out.
Yeah.
And you know, it gets in the way of vision. And but in the end, you find out that if you want to read something, it's horrible. If you want to know what you're doing, it's horrible. If you want to know where you're at, it's not a problem. And this awareness is really what I would argue is the architect's thing.
Right. Well, and you should look at the art of John Baldessari, the Los Angeles contemporary artist, who literally put a dot on his paintings. And I didn't think of this before, but it might have been a teaser on the very subject that you've been discussing.
Samira Zeki, who's invented the term neuroaesthetics, claims that artists have figured all this stuff out before, and they've been pretty good neuroscientists.
Yeah.
And in fact, we're pretty sure that a long-range aesthetic experience takes 9 seconds. That to get total recognition on something you might have trouble with, 9 seconds is kind of what it would be. And a friend of mine, his son's a pretty good expressionistic painter. And I said, so, Hans, what's the name of that one? He goes, oh, that's called 9 seconds. Like, well, why do you call it 9 seconds? Because that's how long it takes people to get it. And so I think, you know, artists have a pretty good idea about, you know, saturating different parts of the brain to achieve certain goals. And that's what Zeki is talking about.
Okay. Well, the last point I wanted to make, and it's coming back to the theme that you started with, and that is empathy, and how perhaps you've been able to tie empathy and embodied simulation into the design practice. How does it interface possibly with the design studios that you're teaching?
Well, the simplest answer is if they're in my studio, the answer is always the same. The body measures architecture. The body measures it. And so then it becomes an unfolding about how do we begin to understand that? How do we put that into the work? And sometimes it's as overt as you making a matrix of Johannes Plasma's 7 senses. And we ask of the work, how does it smell? How does it look? How does it taste? And we just go through the list. And we're trying to become experts, if you will, masters of this media of the body in terms of this sensory. But I mean, this is really the thing that ANFA's, I think, has taught the world so far, is that architecture is a multi-sensory experience. And that if architects don't get past the visual privilege, we're not going to really improve our profession. But I think that, you know, to answer your question, I mean, it's quite overt in the room, and we just beat on it like a coach. Fred, what measures architecture? All right. How many ways have you put it onto your work? Have you looked at how that smells yet? Oh, I didn't think about how that smelled. All right, well, can we put something to that? And then we read about embodied stimulation in the hope that we can make that kind of leap, but that's next semester.
Thank you, Fred, for these really great questions. And
before I see you, Fred.
Before I give the word to our students, I will just bring another thread because while we were just mentioning this with the body as the measuring tool, and this is also what's interesting, that now we can use these technologies, like you showed also in your presentation with measuring how the skin is responding. That we can actually use this technology to be able to transform what our body already measures just by itself, but transform it into some kind of data that we can work with. That's also what's really exciting about integrating this technology in the kind of experiments you do. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about this, because I think our students hadn't heard about it before. I think for them it was the first time.
Well, let me frame it a couple of ways. So again, we're interested in emotions because emotions are faster than feelings. You can ask people how they feel but emotions have already taken effect. When we talk about, I don't know, an ugly building, and people have to work in there, and you ask about their feelings, they're thinking, if I lose my job, I can't feed anybody. No, it's fine. It's fine. And then every second they're in that space, they want to run away. That cannot be good for them. One of the, I'll borrow from my friend Colin Ellis. So Colin has come to the conclusion that one of the things that's interesting about science is how it sits outside and narrows the scope so we can observe things with machinery. And the machinery for studying emotions is not a lot. You can read the brain, but studying emotions is more difficult. And the sensory things that we have are the best. In simple terms, if we take galvanic skin, which studies arousal, we can know whether you're aroused or not. The easiest way to get you aroused, I say, tell me about your mother. There's no one who doesn't respond by being aroused when you say, tell me about your mother. That's me. But we don't know what the valence is. We don't know whether you're happy or sad. So the axis between joy or pleasure up here where architecture lies, and down here where fear, run, danger, I got to get out of this place. So there's an axis of emotions between these two. Most things are a combination. So in order to get the valence, right, the strength of positive and negative valence, we need other devices. If you're happy, feel good, your blood goes to your extremities, goes out to your fingers, out to your skin, and you're warm. And so we can take your temperature and see how you respond. Or we can check your heart rate. Your heart rate goes down. Or we can check your breathing. Your breathing slows down. And we're talking about micro instances of this. I have devices that can measure 25/100th of a second, which is much faster than we need. The other side, right, is if you need to run, you need to protect yourself. The blood goes to the core to protect your organs and your brain. So your fingers become cool, your skin becomes cool. And in order to get more blood to the right spots, the heart rate goes up. And because heart rate goes up, respiration goes up. So we can see how people respond. Now, this happens very quickly, and you will not even be aware that this is going on, but we can see it in the devices. Let me put another point on the table. That said, right, that's science. And getting good data is very, very difficult, I found, but we've tried. Colin Eller has observed that kind of both our cases, our ability to collect data, which he said we're doing right. But he says what's interesting about architecture is he says that in science, we train scientists to sit outside the phenomenon and look inside through instrumentation, which is detached. We're not involved. We're observers. He says what's interesting about architects tune their body as the instrument of evaluation, of observation. So this is quite interesting. So coming from Colin gives me a level of security to begin to think and say that this is really what we should be doing, right? How do we tune the body, our own body, as a way of measuring the world around us? And if we would give credit to a musician who can play the violin magically, no one would say, oh, look how well they've tuned their body to that. No one would question it. Or a physician, oh, look at how skillful their hands are. No one would question that. Or an athlete, look how well they can shoot baskets or hit a baseball. No one questions this. An architect who manipulates the banal things of construction in a way in which become a superior performance. Like, let's just talk about what it costs. I think this is one of the things we're missing. But I think this is really what certainly Maria and I both think about it doing a studio. Like, how do I tune the students' bodies in a way in which they become masters of the experience in the space around them. And then we somehow have to convince the world that this is what architects really do. We're masters of the performance of the bodies in space, and that all this banal construction around us is the way in which we perform that. Well, I mean, that's the thing. That stuff is so banal. How can anyone make magic of that? And yet, that's what we do. That's a long answer. Sorry.
Oh, it's wonderful, and it makes exactly the connection with the very first start now of this course, because our students have they have this homework that they have to do, and they're called instructions to prepare the body for work, and they are a group of about 10 audio files that they can play at home to do all these different experiments by interacting with the body at different scales. But maybe at some other point we can talk about it. Now I would like to give them the words, so please bring your questions. It's your chance. I'm sure that you heard so many new things and you must have many questions to do, so please go ahead.
They sound just like my students.
I think Maike wants to ask something.
Yeah, maybe I have one practical question about your experiment. Because as far as I understood, you were concerned with the question of how our peripheral vision impacts our perception of space and of architecture. But I didn't really get why you used two different environments for your study, and why it wasn't enough to use one environment and then separate central from peripheral vision. Yeah, that was actually the only thing I didn't really.
The simple answer was they gave us money to do it that way. Okay, so having said that, no, it came from the Driehaus Foundation. The Driehaus is a classical, they study classical architecture and classical urban spaces, and so we added that. But also just we were curious actually, is because Colin has looked at through very simple devices where he would have his graduate students with a stopwatch and watch people cross old buildings and glass buildings, and they figured out people walk faster in front of a glass building than they do a stone building. So that was part of it, that we just wanted to set up some opposition between the Chicago, which is where they're at, the Chicago glass building versus some classical building, to see if people noticed. They didn't notice all that much, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
They gave us money to do it. Kind of like that. Okay. But it would be interesting to spend a little bit more energy on that, and I think Elizabeth's experiments and things that we've begun to think about how does the context, so to speak, of peripheral vision teach us something about what when we look at things. Like, so if we think about the hammer, right? If you were in the shop, you would have a different attitude about the hammer than if someone put it in your bathroom, right? And then nothing has changed except the context of the place. Yeah, work on that a while. That's a good question.
That's great, Bob. Especially this topic of the context, because we will be playing with this for the exercise, because our students will be collecting these movements, and then they have to perform with them in other contexts, and also sounds, these sounds of the everyday. We want to create this experience which on purpose shakes things up and makes us work with our memory and with our associations. But we will get there in time. I think Johanna also wants to do a question because she turned on the camera.
Yeah, I have a question about the moods, because you talked about how architecture creates moods, and that then is this affected by vision? If you only see some part of it, does it affect the mood?
Yeah, this is, we entered into a kind of a complex discussion, which is why I put music into the game. I mean, someone, I think it was, wasn't it some famous German philosopher said architecture is frozen music? I don't believe it, but the mood is a very long running emotive state. And so if you imagine, your own kind of playing in this, when you come to a room, do you turn the lights on? Do you adjust the lights down? And depending on what your goal might be. When I first started talking to scientists, I see Fred's gone. And Elizabeth, okay, good. No more. There's no more scientists here. We can talk. They would think that talking about atmosphere and mood was very lightweight kind of conversations. And I would ask them if they'd ever had a romantic dinner at home. And they said, of course. And I said, well, was mood involved? Did you want to set a mood? Did you do something? And so, it's not lightweight from that standpoint. So this is what we're talking about. I mean, it's not an abstraction, which is the point we're trying to make. Mood is not an abstraction. It's something which is very visceral. Does that get to your point?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting how what we see affects the mood, because if you think about architecture, it might be used by people who don't have full vision. So I think that's very interesting to think about, just seeing how what we see can affect how we experience a room.
Well, this is the theory of embodied stimulation, right? That it makes it, in a way, makes real. You guys ever watch The Matrix? I love that movie. The notion that the mind makes it real. I love that line. The mind makes it real, and this is where we're at, right? The mind, from embodied stimulation, right? The mind makes it real, and modern rationalism likes to split that away. That somehow the rational mind is not attached to the body, and it's not participant in that. It's just observing it as some kind of a scientific enterprise. Nope, we're all viscerally attached. Maria, do you talk about Alvin Noe? Do you know that guy?
Not yet, not yet.
Okay, you might like him actually. He's quite an interesting character in terms of how cleanly he can make analogies that are really good for us as architects to use in terms of where space is. And what's not known well about Alvin Noe is that he started with vision science. And so he's led now to consciousness and how art and consciousness operate. So it's pretty good. And he sounds very architectural, but I haven't been able to meet him yet.
And this notion that perception is always active, that's also something really, really interesting about his work, how he always refers to, even if we are sitting, spacing out and not doing anything in particular, we are always active because we're always perceiving everything which is happening in our surroundings, and we're always somehow prepared to respond to it. We're always active.
So when I was a young guy in a high school science class, they said, you only use 10% of your brain, and the rest is not very busy, and that's just wrong. You use 100% of your brain all the time, and mostly what the brain does is sort too much information coming in. And this is really one of the things that architecture offers, right? The order of something so that the brain can sort it and put it into the background. Isn't this great? What architects do is make something that's easy to sort and put into the background, so it should be forgotten. Yeah. Isn't that great? Isn't it? You spent hours and hours, years and years to build something that's fantastic, and your goal is to make it go into the subconscious, so no one knows you did it. Yeah, nice profession we can find ourselves in.
But it's also the stuff that stays in our dreams. That's also what's fantastic. Whenever we have dreams, we have these memories of all the spaces. During the pandemic, I had 3 dreams about Venice, that I was walking around Venice. I think I missed traveling and my mind had to bring me back to, to one of my favorite cities.
Well, there's a, by Jennifer Groh is her name. She's a scientist out of Indiana, I think. And she wrote a thing called Making Space. And she makes a case that the relationship in the brain between memories and space is the same thing, right? So your visual sense of space is stored exactly where your memories are. And she said this cannot be a coincidence. Memories and space are the same thing.
I think Laura would also like to do a question.
Actually, yes, because I get the idea that space and architecture gives like viewers a mood, and it's like more in the back of their head. But actually, I question if there is any possibility for us to get some facts or to bring it back to our mind so we can understand it, because we as architects have to actually use it and like place something at a specific point. We have to decide it. So we have to be like, I don't know, get some facts. So we have to bring it forward in our mind again, not just like passively consuming it like viewers.
So the easy answer is that no one can teach you architecture, but you can learn it, right? If you're interested, we can coach you. And so what you were asking about is really about coaching. And so what a good studio critic should do is to bring that question that you have into the front of your mind, right? And then once again, you can master it and push it back in. But to make people self-conscious about how they are in space goes a long ways to instructing you about what it would mean, right? The other way to do it is to play, if you will, with spaces. You know, again, easy things. In my studio, we had a day where everyone had to bring an object that they could put on a table that would transform the space. That was the only thing. One object transformed the space. And this is not easy, but it is quite a good exercise. Put a chair in a room and see what people do with it, but put it in wrong. See how, put it on the table. You know, one of my favorite images of all time is Laura Bush, or Betty Ford, I'll tell you about it. Betty Ford, president's wife. The day she's leaving the White House, she's on the cabinet table dancing. This is not allowed. You can't dance on the cabinet table, but there it is. It's this great picture of her doing something which is completely wrong. You can't do that.
Breaking the protocol.
So, part of, measuring with the body is to use your own body as a kind of experiment. And, your friends are pretty good at, they don't necessarily know they're being tested, but you could put chairs in the room wrong. You put tables in the room wrong. You just set things in a different way and then see what they do, see how they respond to this. Turn the lights down too low and see if they turn them up. So we're observing, these kind of responses that people have with the space, and both as groups and as individuals. And so, yeah, so in a way you answer your own question, right? One is, how do you do it? You make yourself conscious of things which are self-conscious, or your studio critic can help you with that. And the other thing is to play with those things, learning about them, your own self.
Thank you. Yeah, that helped a lot.
This was a great question, Laura. Thank you so much. I think Annalena would also like to make a question.
I see how this is working. They're not really raising their hands, but they're going to do it. Well done. You ladies are impressive, right? If you can follow my English, you're already, way ahead of the game, because I'm terrible. I wish I could speak German.
Yes, I'm very proud of them, because normally it's difficult to get our students to talk, but they're very engaged and it's wonderful. Go ahead, Annalena.
So actually, I was just curious about this experiment with those two different buildings like we had before with Maike, did you also test like where the viewers would look first? Like with this vision tracking, you could also do stuff like that. Like, for example, there was this egg. Was it like always first point of interest?
So the good news, bad news, right? So I don't know how that translates to German. It was mostly a movie that was set up for them because we couldn't let their eye wander. So we had to just a quick burst of the image and then a fixation and then another burst of the image and a fixation. Now we're actually looking more at eye tracking to see if we can learn a bit more about what is next to where the eye is looking. So Paul and I are very interested in not central vision, but what's near central vision and what that might tell us. So there are new tools for this. Do you guys use virtual reality in your studio work?
No.
We're just kind of beginning that. In fact, one of the things that you reminded me of it is, I hope we can do this next semester, where we're going to have the students, when they build their models, go through, and we're going to record them going through their own models. And then we're going to have other people go through it and see what happens, if other people would find the same track or they were looking at something different. But that would be quite interesting, right? And so in this case, it's actually kind of funny. Every time the subjects turned, their arousal would spike. And Colin's like, geez, I don't understand why is this happening? Well, Colin, they just turned. And then we found out later that if you were walking in the street and you came to the corner of the street and you had to wait, your arousal would spike until you could cross the street. And so this is often the case. You know, we're relaxed because we're moving and we have to make a judgment. Now the arousal goes up, whatever the judgment might be. So in a space, if you wanted to get people to be more involved in it, you might set a statue, a painting, a change of light, a bolt of sunshine. I mean, this is kind of a game that we're playing, and that would be also a way of increasing arousal. And if you increase arousal, you increase memory. If you increase memory, then we call that aesthetic. Now that's some good thinking you got going on there. But in our case, that was a very primitive experiment. And now we're kind of moving into a whole new game that maybe someday I'll come back and talk about the new game. I told you the old game today because, well, I was ready for that.
Next time, we want to hear about everything. So maybe the three other colleagues who didn't have questions yet, if you would like to, don't worry if you think, oh, maybe my English is not good enough and so on. Don't worry. It's usually much better than you think. Okay, maybe they're just tired because we actually started at 4, so it's been already some time. So if there are no further questions, I want to thank again Fred for being here. Wonderful surprise. Thank you so much also for your questions.
Thanks, Fred.
And thank you, Bob, so much for this wonderful lecture and this really nourishing conversation. And I hope maybe next semester, maybe we make another meeting to talk about the new game.
Excellent plan. Maybe you can meet my studio. And,
oh yes,
we could talk.
I have good news about that for you. I will write about that today still.
All right, excellent.
Okay.
Well, thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Bob. See you next time. Bye-bye.